So us guitar players have a very complicated relationship with music theory. While most of you would probably agree that music theory is worth learning as a guitarist, there are countless examples of great guitar players who didn't know any music theory. So do you think that you need to know music theory to become a great guitar player? Let me know in the comments below. As a guitar teacher of 17 years, I feel like I'm in a unique position because I've seen what works and what doesn't work. And today I'm going to go into depth and cover all of that. But first, I just want to remind you about my courses. If you've been trying to learn to play like Eddie Van Halen and you are just getting nowhere with it, then my course Shred Like Ed is for you. I break down everything that I know about Eddie Van Halen's playing in this 26-hour long deep dive of a course. So that's Shred Like Ed. Check it out in the description below. So generally in my experience, guitar players have two firm stances on music theory. The first stance is usually held by players who have learnt their music theory and they've seen the benefits it provides and therefore they recommend every guitarist learn music theory. And then you have the other side of the coin, guitarists who didn't learn any music theory but are still great players. And from their perspective, they don't need to learn music theory to be effective musicians. So who's right? Well, both. The benefits to learning music theory are pretty obvious. But what do I even mean by music theory? You could mean a lot of things. You could be talking about reading musical notation. You could be talking about chords, scales, rhythm, time signatures, key signatures, the modes, and plenty of other stuff. But while I agree that there's great value in learning all that stuff, I think it's only really worth learning the stuff that you will use and apply. I studied music at university. I have a Bachelor of Music from the UTAS Conservatorium. So for me, this involved 4 years of studying, which included some jazz theory as well as some classical theory. So I completed that degree in 2008, which at the time of filming was about 30,000 years ago. And as a result, there's a lot of content within that degree that I have forgotten. Well, I assume that I've forgotten because I haven't gone back and brushed up on it just for fun. I'm not that much of a psychopath. And while some of the theory that I learnt that is relevant to what I do has stuck, the stuff that I don't use has just floated away. And while I'm sure I could relearn it fairly easily if I had to, I don't see the point in doing so because the reason it floated off in the first place is because I wasn't using it. So I think that's a valid lesson on why you should learn what you need to learn and don't bother with the rest. Music theory does not need to be this big, intimidating Mount Everest of books and treble clefs. All it really needs to be is just the ability for you to answer the questions that you have about the music you play and listen and enjoy. Now, I am actually considering in the future putting together a theory course for guitarists with just the stuff that you need and none of the extra stuff. Because I think it's that extra stuff that is really intimidating and overwhelming for most of us. If that's a course that would interest you, please let me know in the comments below and I'll get to work on it. But in the meantime, I'm cooking up something else. But anyway, what music theory do guitarists really need to know? Well, I think you need to know the names of the notes along the fretboard, at least on the E and the A string. I think you need to know all your chords within a key. And I think you need to know your major and minor scales. Having a basic understanding of the modes does not hurt either, but I don't think you need to learn to sight read musical notation unless you're planning on becoming a studio session musician, and I don't think those even really exist anymore, sadly. Or planning to become a jazz musician, I would say it's essential in that case. But something tells me that most of the folks that watch this channel are probably not planning on becoming jazz musicians. I could be wrong. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. And of course, the other situation I can think of that's worth learning musical notation is for playing in pit bands in music theatre situations. It's worth buying a guitar method book and just developing a cursory basic knowledge of sight reading, but for most people it's not a skill you're going to get a whole lot of use out of as a rock guitar player. You never saw Hendrix sight reading, you never saw Eddie sight reading, and most of the greats who could sight read weren't particularly good at sight reading. Plus, honestly, sight reading is quite a difficult skill to learn, and I really take my hat off to any guitarist who is super good at it. The Carl Verheijens of the world, I salute you. If you don't know who Carl Verheyen is, check him out. He's got some incredible stories. So the benefits to learning music theory are fairly obvious. But here's an important question. Is there a downside to learning music theory? Well, for the longest time, I thought the answer was strictly no, because I was a big fan of everyone must learn music theory, and if you don't, you are a lazy heathen. But as I've come to realize, that viewpoint is quite one-dimensional. Now, if we take one of the greatest guitar players of all time, Edward Van Halen, how much theory do you think he knew? Well, according to my buddy Alan Garber, Ed knew almost no music theory. Now, anybody who knows Ed's playing well, especially his lead playing, will know that almost all of his solos deviate from the scale in one way or another. And these notes from outside the scale would give Ed's playing a jazziness and a flavour that other rock players just didn't have. Ed would do things like at the end of the jump solo where he played, which harmonically does not make any sense. We're in the key of B flat minor and those first two strings make sense. But now we should be going, but instead he carries on doing the same shape. So we have one wrong note there. And now we're on the major third, we should be on the minor third. And then the same here, we should be going, but instead we go. So we're hitting all kinds of wrong notes. And guess what? It just sounds cool when Ed does it, especially because he follows the golden rule of landing on a strong note, which fits beautifully over the C chord. So what I'm getting at is that I don't think players like Edward knew music theory in a conventional way. I think from spending tens of thousands of hours playing on his guitar as well as on his piano, he established a rule in his head of which notes he liked and which notes he didn't, which notes he wanted to emphasize and which notes he could use as passing notes. And really, at the end of the day, if you have a really great set of ears and you can hear what works and what doesn't, and you can learn to anticipate what works and what doesn't, then you don't really need to learn music theory. Or at least you can get away without learning it. And in Edward's lifetime, there were only a few experiences where his lack of theory knowledge really impaired him. But with Van Halen's music, he was able just to sit and play and see what worked. And he would just throw away what didn't work. And that's how he would arrive at those great solos that we all know and love. Now, in my opinion, if Eddie had been raised to play guitar with the good boy approach, which is learning music theory and doing everything by the book, then there's no way we would have gotten things like... Instead, he would have thought the way that most of the rest of us did, which is when you improvise a solo, you play within the scale and you do not go outside of that scale. And you almost treat that scale as a prison. And even if you're going to play fast, you have to play all the correct notes. Now, I think Eddie was smart enough to realize early on that that approach will just slow you down. Because instead of just following the lines and being a good boy, he decided to take his car and fly around and break all the rules. And I'm sure many of you have had that experience when you're learning a Van Halen solo where you go, hang on, you're not allowed to play that. Those notes aren't legal. And you play it slowly and go, wow, this sounds wrong. But then when you play it at speed, oh, it actually makes sense at speed. You can get away with a few wrong notes as long as it's fast and as long as you're emphasizing the right notes. So while I think that learning music theory has a lot going for it and it will generally strengthen you as a guitarist, it's important to acknowledge that in some scenarios, knowledge can be a curse, and it can prevent you from seeing or hearing what might work better. So I think it's almost a hat you want to take on and off. Now, when you take your music theory hat off, I think it's very important to focus on putting your ears on. All the greats have one thing in common. Whether or not they know music theory, they've all got great ears. They can hear what they want to play and they can manipulate the sound until it's just right. That in itself is a huge part of their ability and their skill. And I think Eddie's approach to tuning is a great example. He knew what he liked in terms of tuning. He knew that if he flattened the B string, those A-shaped chords would just sound a little bit sweeter. And I think that's incredibly perceptive because up until recently, I just tune my guitar and go, well, it's in tune, so that has to sound good, right? And the idea of intentionally detuning a string to make a chord sound better was almost wrong. It was at odds with my beliefs. But now I've learned that tuning is more complex than just tuning to a tuner and hoping for the best. Now, obviously there's a downside to not knowing your music theory as well. I remember one of my lecturers at university, his name was Al, and he was telling us a story about why music theory is important to learn. And what happened was Al had a mate who was living in a different city, and the mate was coming over to do some gigs, and he had to hire some local musicians to play his music. Now, this guy couldn't write music, couldn't read music, didn't understand any music theory, didn't even know what chords he was playing on the guitar. And so he rang my lecturer Al up and said, hey Al, I need you to write a whole bunch of charts for me tonight because I've got a rehearsal with these guys tomorrow morning and I don't have time to teach them the songs. I just need them to know the songs straight away and I don't have any recordings. So Al finished his dinner, went over to his house and sat down with him and watched him play the chords and figured the chords out and wrote out every single chord of every single song that this guy was going to perform in a nice chart form so the musicians could just look at it and go, oh, boom, okay, great. And they could do the gig with minimal rehearsal. And that example really stuck in my mind. You don't want to be that lazy guy who just can't be bothered and then makes everybody else have to work harder because you can't understand what you're doing. But I bet my bottom dollar that there are chords that this guy was playing that were not in the key or that were really funky, unusual voicings that just worked. Because musicians who aren't locked into thinking in terms of theory are generally more likely, in my experience, to come up with unusual chord shapes or sounds that shouldn't work but do work. I think a great example of this is that big band bit from Hot for Teacher. Who comes up with that? That just sounds like random chords. But I think what Ed was really channeling there was the sound of a big band horn section and playing those dissonant chords over a pedal bass. And so I think Ed is kind of the poster child for not letting theory inhibit you creatively. And just because something is not theoretically correct, it doesn't mean it's inherently bad. That Hot for Teacher thing is a perfect example of that. It sounds kind of funky and weird, but it's cool. It's not bad. If anything, it's more colorful. Whereas if Ed had played something that fit the key perfectly, it might still sound great, but I don't think it would have that same jankiness. So dissonance is not a bad thing. And as Ed said, it's music theory, not music fact. So to sum up my thoughts, yes, I do think music theory is worth learning, but only the things that are relevant to what you're doing. When you play a certain riff or a chord progression and something really sticks out as being particularly interesting or quirky to you, stop and try and figure out why. If you keep asking those questions, you'll start to uncover the theory behind it and the patterns will start to emerge. That's how I learned most of the music theory I know. Just by taking chords and scales and rhythms and messing with them until they sounded the way I wanted to sound and then asking, why do they sound the way I want them to sound? But try not to make the mistake that I made and many others make of thinking that theory is everything. I've met many a musician who knew their theory back to front, but could not play a meaningful solo to save themselves. They would play out of tune, they'd play out of time, but because they knew the theory, they thought they were superior. The listener does not care if you know music theory or not. All the listener really cares about is whether or not what you're playing sounds good. One of my favorite Eddie Van Halen quotes that he got from one of his teachers is, if it sounds good, it is good. All right, shredders, don't forget about my course, Shred Like Ed. Come and join me and a whole legion of guitarists learning to unpick Eddie Van Halen's guitar secrets. Thanks for watching. Check out one of these other videos.